Hey everybody, it's Adam's Music Box here, and today we're going to talk about the GOAT, the greatest of all time, the musician who did it all, and that is, of course, Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson represented a pinnacle of pop music and one that I don't think we'll ever see again. So let's break down some of the things that made him the GOAT and will make him frankly, stay the GOAT forever. I don't think anyone's going to break his records, not in terms of the impact he had on the music industry, on culture, on the world as a whole, or even in the specific things that made the quality of his music so unique, distinct, and memorable across generations. So let's look at this quality of longevity. I spoke a few videos ago about one of the main things that a musician needs to have in order to have staying power across generations. This means staying power after someone's final album has been released, after someone has died, even. Obviously, both apply to Michael, unfortunately. And that's this cinematic quality, the sense that listening to a song or listening to an album is about more than just being emoted by the quality of the music, of the production, of the lyrics, of the vocal qualities, even though he had all of that, which we'll get to in a second. But this cinematic quality in music is something where you feel that listening is an event in and of itself, that it's something beyond, something above, something with a psychological beginning, middle, and end, even if it doesn't necessarily have a narrative. It may or it may not, but mentally, psychologically, it's got to have that beginning, middle, and end. And all of Michael Jackson's music has that. He takes you on a journey, an emotional journey, a thrill ride, a slice of fantasy or a slice of life, sometimes combining the two. Now, of course, Michael Jackson was also very cinematic in a literal sense, in addition to having these other figurative, metaphorical qualities. Look at the short films he made, because, of course, with videos like Thriller, we can't really call them videos. They were short films, not only because they were shot on proper 35mm film, directed by proper film directors, but they had such an attention to detail that it matched the music, but crucially, and this is true with these other great musicians that I put into this cinematic category. We talked a few weeks ago about Pink Floyd and Queen, before Michael Jackson's solo debut, anyway. And we talked about Ye, whose first album came out only a few years before Michael Jackson died. They were people that were able to have this cinematic quality to their music that with not only stands the test of time, but also stands up to the fact that you don't necessarily need to see the artist. You don't need to know about the interesting parts of their biography. You don't need to see their thrilling stage shows, which all of those artists I mentioned had. The music in and of itself is enough to have that cinematic quality, and everything that goes around it, whether Michael Jackson's videos, Freddie Mercury's amazing stage presence, Pink Floyd's lavish shows, and frankly, Ye's lavish shows, the most lavish in hip hop history. Those are really interesting bonuses, but the music stands alone. You put on any Michael Jackson single, you frankly put on any Michael Jackson LP, and it just pulls you in. Now, there's another quality about Michael Jackson that's perhaps even rarer than that cinematic quality. And this is the ability of Michael Jackson music to span the age gap. Now, what do I mean by that? When Led Zeppelin came out in 1969, it was primarily for young people, primarily for male. When someone like Helen Reddy came out, she was specifically catering, whether consciously or unconsciously, but it was probably conscious, to a mostly female audience. There's certain music that's put out to attract older people. There's certain music that's made, let's say, for businesses, 101 Strings, the great Muzak, if you will, that came out in the 60s and has been produced in many decades since. But there was a comment from Blood, Sweat, and Tears drummer Bobby Colomby, who was recently on the Adam Carolla podcast. And he said that what was unique about Blood, Sweat, and Tears when they really broke through with their second self titled album was that it appealed to everyone. The kids liked it, the older people liked it, men liked it, women liked it, black audiences listened to it, white audiences listened to it. It was very universal in its appeal across demographic lines. And Michael Jackson was able to achieve that. And he did so, much like Blood, Sweat, and Tears, by doing something unique. And I think for this, we need to focus on Thriller because, of course, Michael Jackson had Off the Wall, his first solo album, his first grown-up solo album. Let's leave it like that. But the album that, of course, really made Michael Jackson from a big star into the king of pop, that was Thriller. And what Thriller did was refuse to compromise. Let's look at what the music scene was like in 1982. So, the music scene at that time was a combination of things. There was a rock and roll revival, so the whole disco sucks thing of the late 70s, where people wanted some more hard rock to return. That was happening. You had Van Halen, you had the new wave of British heavy metal coming out, the Judas Priest, the Iron Maidens really starting to hit their stride. The soul scene was transformed from one dominated by funk in the early and mid 70s to disco in the late 70s to something called electro funk in the early 80s. Think Roger Troutman and Zapp. Think the SOS band. Think how the Isley Brothers reinvented themselves at this time with the Between the Sheets album in particular. Now, it goes without saying that Michael Jackson and his producer Quincy Jones, longtime collaborator, they absorbed all these influences, and they were, in their previous incarnations, in many ways responsible for many of these. But what was so unique about Thriller, even within this context, was the fact that Michael Jackson didn't compromise to anyone. He didn't say, oh, I'm going to specifically fuse this and this style. I'm going to specifically exclude this and include this. It was really as though Thriller invented its own genre while still being something familiar enough for musical comfort for the fans of all those other genres, almost all of which were incidentally incorporated into Thriller. Now, you can't talk about the GOAT without talking about production quality. Thriller was simply one of the finest produced albums of all time in terms of the arrangements and instrumentation, in terms of the actual mix, in terms of Bernie Grundman's original mastering. It had the whole package. It was one of those albums that would never be made again because the music industry has become very cheap. The music industry in the late 70s and early 80s did go through somewhat of a financial low, though nothing compared to what it went through post Napster. But with Michael Jackson's Thriller, big production came back because Thriller had all of the funds behind it necessary to hire some of the absolute best musicians in the world, whether they were session musicians, whether they were stars in their own right who played on the album. Think people like Steve Lukather, of course, Eddie Van Halen's great solo in Beat It, which happened very spontaneously and last minute, but Michael knew what he wanted, so did Quincy, and it really worked. And this high level of production was associated with every Michael Jackson record, those that were produced by Jones, those that weren't, those that kept reinventing styles, because no two Michael Jackson records sound the same. Now, Michael's voice was remarkably consistent, even between childhood and adulthood. Obviously, people's voices change, particularly males, but there was a uniquely consistent quality to his voice. And a lot of people have been listening, especially lately, to some of the stems, the vocal stems. So when you're recording to multi-track, as all modern records are, you obviously have vocals on one channel. Realistically, there'll be different vocal tracks across as many as 5, sometimes more channels. It's up to the producer. Every other instrument usually having its own channel. Drums could be split across several because of multi-miking and all that. I digress. If you listen to Michael's essentially his isolated vocals from any period in his career, you start to realize what we really mean by goat, because there are a lot of musicians, even good singers, where when you listen to the isolated vocal, independent from the rest of the recording, it can sound a bit cringe. It can sound a bit uncomfortable, thinking, oh, I get that this is what it sounds like in isolation, but it was recorded with the intention of being part of this wider thing. And let's just bring the music tracks back up so I can once again listen and enjoy it. With Michael Jackson, there's no such thing. His voice is pitch perfect. It never wobbles. The intonation, the timbre, everything is literally perfect. So not only was the full package this grand cinematic psychological experience that draws you in, brings you on this thrill ride, whether a happy song, whether a sad song, whether a tense song, because tension is of course a huge part of music, and Michael Jackson had that in spades. But his voice was absolutely perfect, and it stayed perfect his entire life. He was simply a natural, but he was able to use that natural ability and refine it into something that was super technical. The other thing that makes Michael Jackson a goat is the sense of occasion that was implicit in his music. A lot of people today, especially younger people, probably don't remember that in the late 60s, 70s, and even in much of the 80s, the Super Bowl halftime show was a bit corny. It was a bit low production at times. There were a lot of youth choirs and marching bands, and all of that's fine. And you could argue that it's really good to give amateur and youth musicians a national televised spotlight as opposed to pop stars, rock stars, hip hop stars that already have a spotlight built into their career. But the Super Bowl is the single most important televised event in the world. And so it was in the early 1990s that the NFL decided they needed someone with more of a sense of an occasion. They needed a superstar. Who did they call? They called Michael Jackson. Look up that video. You can find it pretty easily online of him performing at the Super Bowl. I believe it was the one where one of the two where the Bills played the Cowboys in the early 90s. Now, when Michael makes his grand entrance, he stands still, speechless, no background music going for what felt like forever. And the story goes that the Super Bowl producers were really, really nervous because what the hell is this guy doing? When is he going to start? Michael Jackson knew exactly what he was doing. In the silence of him standing there in his pose with his great costumes and all of the rest of it, he was solidifying a moment, building that tension, getting the audience to wonder what's going on. Is he trying to upstage the Super Bowl? Has he lost his mind? What's going on? And then, boom, the music starts and he delivers a performance of a lifetime, single-handedly reinvents what the Super Bowl halftime show is. So if you love the Dr. Dre produced Super Bowl from a few years back, which was one of the best ever, thank Michael Jackson. If you like Prince playing the guitar in the rain to Purple Rain, thank Michael Jackson. The Beyonce show, some of the great rock shows that we've had over the years since that time, thank Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson's music was an occasion in itself, and because of that, he knew he needed to bring it big when you were marrying that music to another occasion. That was possibly most evident in the Super Bowl, but whether playing at award shows, whether playing at charity concerts, at other major events, he was always able to elevate the full performance to a level that matched the occasion. There was never anything understated about Michael Jackson's music and his performance of it, but nor was there anything pompous about it. There was a feeling of sincerity. There was a feeling of great craftsmanship. There was a feeling that no corners were cut. The dance moves never came at the expense of the singing. The production never came at the expense of the kinds of musicians he wanted around him. The evolving styles of music that Jackson experimented with from his early days with his brother and brothers until his final album, it was always something evolving, but always having that cinematic quality, that high quality that of music, that high quality of vocals. That always stayed. There are a million more reasons that people could think of about why Michael Jackson was the GOAT and is the GOAT. The way that we consume music is very different. The high production values of albums like Thriller and Bad are probably never going to come back. The music industry has contracted so much so that a lot of albums today aren't even recorded in traditional studios. Many of the great studios, whether in LA, New York, London, elsewhere, have shut down because they don't have enough customers to justify the huge overhead it takes to run these big studios. And that's frankly sad because these studios were special places. They could do things that even with the most advanced home setups, you still can't really do. But for most genres of music that are popular today, you can do it in the home. But I don't think you could really approximate Thriller in the home. Even most studios of the day couldn't necessarily pull it off with the level of quality of the studios they used. Alan Sides, of course, very involved in that. One of the greatest studio magnates, if you will, of all time, behind the Ocean Way brand. He sold his studios a few years back. He's still making speakers and other equipment. So that's one of the reasons you won't have it. Another Thriller or another Michael Jackson in total. One of the other reasons is because when we don't really have any singular superstars anymore. There's an exception, and that's Ye. You could point to another exception outside the hip hop world and the pop world, even though Ye sort of made hip hop into pop. Watch a few videos ago, and we'll understand that. But there's Taylor Swift, but on the whole, we're less willing to embrace superstars than we used to be because the way that music is distributed is more personalized, it's more fragmented, it's more segmented. So if we have, let's say, a 1940s model, no television, a few radio stations, fewer recordings being made, everyone in the 1940s knew who Bing Crosby was. Absolutely everyone. Man, woman, child, West Coast, East Coast, Europe, North America, everyone knew. And that model continued even as the industry expanded, even as AM becomes AM and FM, even as the single becomes the single and the album, even as we go from lo-fi to hi-fi to stereo to quadraphonic to compact disc. It was really the internet that was a line in the sand of this segmentation whereby whether it's of our own volition, let's say I'm only going to listen to this kind of music or this kind of artist, or whether it's people following algorithms that are generally in their default mode designed to give music to people that is in fitting with the kind of stuff they already listen to. We're all sort of in our own little cubbyholes, in our own little corners. So the idea that we'll have another Michael Jackson is probably rare because as big as Ye is, and he's huge, and he's got this staying power, as big as Taylor Swift is, and she's not going anywhere anytime soon. Michael Jackson, in terms of his size and his stature, was something other than else. And even today, people that might not know a Taylor Swift song, that might sound crazy to young people, but such people exist. Even people that might not be able to identify a Ye song, and some people do exist like that, but everyone alive today, unless they're living under a rock or living in a very isolated part of the world, they will be able to instantly recognize Michael Jackson's biggest hits, and the vast majority of those people will be able to identify those hits directly with Michael Jackson. I'm sure there are lots of other reasons we can point to that he is the GOAT. But for now, these are at least some of the reasons that Michael Jackson is the greatest of all time. Remember to like, subscribe, and all of those fun things, and keep listening for other genres, other artists, or musical tastes catered for. Put your requests in the comments below.